She stood in the middle of the highway, barefoot in a soaked white wedding dress, her mascara bleeding into tears. "Please, help me," she whispered, shivering in the rain. David Carter pulled over, rolled down the window of his old pickup. He had no idea this moment of kindness would drag him into a billionaire's warpath. 12 hours later, men in suits kicked open his front door. "You made a mistake, mechanic," one of them smirked. "She doesn't belong to you." If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. The rain hadn't let up for hours. It slammed against the windshield like it was trying to stop David from driving down that rural Alabama road. He wasn't even supposed to be out this late. He'd closed the garage early after his last customer, but couldn't sleep. Something had told him to go for a drive, just to clear his head. What he saw next would change everything. She was walking along the shoulder of the road like a ghost from a dream. No shoes. Wet gown dragging in the mud. Arms hugging herself, head down, face pale under the orange streetlights. David slowed down and stopped. "Ma'am," he called out gently. She looked up. Her face was streaked with mascara and tears. She was white, maybe late 20s, with a cut on her lip and her hair tangled like she'd run through a storm. "Please. I don't have anywhere to go." Something about her eyes hit him. That same emptiness he'd seen in the mirror a decade ago, the day he got fired because his white supervisor said the shop needed to look more professional. "Hop in," he said, without thinking twice. He handed her a towel from the back seat as she slid in. She smelled like roses and smoke. His old pickup groaned as he drove in silence for a few minutes. "I'm Isabella," she murmured, still shaking. "I left my wedding 3 hours ago." David didn't ask for details. Not yet. But he noticed how her hands trembled even after the heater was turned up. And how she kept looking at the side mirror, like someone might be following. He didn't know who she was running from. But by the next morning, he'd find out her ex-fiancé was a real estate tycoon used to owning people, and he didn't like when his property ran away. And worse, he didn't like that a black mechanic had helped her. The morning sun barely peeked through the blinds when David heard the soft clink of a mug in the kitchen. Isabella stood barefoot again, but this time in one of his oversized t-shirts, pouring coffee with shaky hands. Her wedding dress, now dry, hung like a ghost over a chair. "I didn't sleep," she admitted. "But thank you for not asking questions last night." David sat down across from her. "Didn't think you needed more pressure." She gave a broken smile. He proposed after 2 months. Lavish dinners, flowers, gifts. "I thought it was love. But it was ownership." David nodded slowly. "What does he do?" She hesitated. "Richard Blackwood. He owns half the buildings downtown. His name's on everything. My apartment lease. My car. Even my phone plan." David raised an eyebrow. "So when you ran from everything." Her eyes welled up again. "He's not just rich. He's powerful. And he hates losing." David glanced at the door, now locked. His gut was already screaming that this wasn't just a messy breakup. She sat at the table, holding her mug tight. "He doesn't scream. He just controls. Where I go. What I wear. Who I talk to. And when I question things, he froze my cards. Said I'd learn respect." David leaned back. He'd known that type of man. The ones who wore expensive watches and treated workers like dirt. Men who smiled while calling you, boy, with their eyes. "You still want to go back?" he asked. She shook her head, firm this time. "I'd rather be homeless than his trophy." He watched her for a moment. Then got up, grabbed a blanket from the couch, and handed it to her. "You stay here. At least for now. She blinked in surprise. Why would you risk that? David shrugged. Because I've seen enough men like him to know they count on everyone being scared. I'm not. She didn't say anything. But the way her shoulders relaxed said everything. Neither of them knew that, while they sat there sipping coffee, a black BMW was parked 3 streets down, engine running, windows tinted. Inside, a scar-faced man scrolled through his phone. "She's with a mechanic," he texted. And hit send. David was under the hood of a battered Honda when the first patrol car pulled into the lot. He didn't think much of it, until the second one followed and 2 officers stepped out, hands on their belts like they already owned the place. "You David Carter?" one asked, flipping through a notepad. "Yeah," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "We've received an anonymous tip about stolen car parts being sold out of this shop," the officer continued, voice flat like he'd already made up his mind. David didn't flinch. "You're welcome to look around. Everything here's logged and licensed." Still, they walked in like they were raiding a trap house. Opened cabinets, pulled drawers, tapped on toolboxes like they were looking for a reason to escalate. Isabella watched from inside, her face pale. David stayed calm. He'd learned long ago that arguing only fed their suspicion. The cops left empty-handed 30 minutes later. "We'll file the report. For now, you're clean," the older one said with a shrug. David didn't answer. He just locked the gate behind them. The silence afterward felt louder than the search. Isabella stepped forward. "That wasn't random, was it?" "Nope," he said. "It was a warning." The next blow came faster than expected. That afternoon, 3 longtime customers canceled their appointments with odd excuses. Family emergency. Need to reschedule. Car got sold. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Isabella stood by the counter, guilt thick in her voice. "Maybe I should go." David looked at her. "You think this stops if you leave?" She hesitated. "He doesn't want you back," David continued. "He wants to punish you. And now I'm in the way." She clenched her jaw. "Then I should get out of the way." "No," he said sharply. "That's what men like him count on. Fear. Silence. People backing down. I'm not built that way." She looked like she wanted to cry, but didn't. That night, David sat on the porch alone, sipping cold coffee. His phone buzzed, a private number. He answered. A soft, mocking voice spoke. "Did you enjoy the morning show, David? That was just a taste." "Who is this?" "You know exactly who this is. And I suggest you return what's mine before I start getting creative." David's voice was calm. "She's not a thing." There was a pause. "Oh, David. Everything's a thing when you're rich enough. Even mechanics." The line went dead. David sat still. He wasn't surprised. But now it was clear, this wasn't about a runaway bride. This was about power. About ownership. And Richard Blackwood had just declared war. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments, I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. David didn't sleep that night. He sat at his workbench long after Isabella had gone to bed, the shop dark except for a flickering desk lamp. On the table beside him, a notepad, his phone, and a cheap digital camera. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. If Richard wanted to play games, then it was time someone watched the chessboard too. Every blacked-out SUV that slowed down near the garage. David photographed it. Every missed call, every strange car parked across the street. Logged. He even made sure the security cameras, barely used in months, were now recording every second. The next morning, Isabella placed 2 mugs of coffee on the bench. She looked tired, like sleep had been impossible. "He'll never stop," she said quietly. Not until one of us breaks. David looked at her. Then let's make sure it's not us. She stared at him, eyes wide. You're serious? He nodded once. Her shoulders dropped, relief, maybe. Then she walked to the office and returned with something unexpected, a phone. Not hers. A different one, older, cracked, no SIM. She placed it on the bench. Everything he ever showed me. I saved it. David stared at her. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. He used to brag about his power. Thought I'd be impressed. Showed me contracts, spreadsheets, messages, even photos of him handing bribes to city officials. She clicked the screen to life. Dozens of images. Scanned documents. Emails with threats. I took pictures of everything, she whispered. At first, I told myself it was just in case. But deep down, I knew. I'd need it someday. David scrolled through the evidence slowly, his jaw tight. This isn't just control, he muttered. This is organized crime. She looked down. I didn't know who to give it to. You just did. David spent the rest of the day reviewing everything. Names, payments, locations. Every bribe, every signature. The man wasn't just a bully, he was a walking indictment waiting to happen. And now, David Carter, the mechanic Richard underestimated, had enough to destroy him. For the first time in days, David smiled. It wasn't just defiance now. It was strategy. If Richard thought this was about one scared woman and one small garage, he'd made the mistake of his life. David wasn't scared. He was planning. 2 days later, David returned from a parts run to find an old brown Buick parked in front of the garage. Mr. Williams, his landlord, stood beside it, a man David had known for 5 years. They'd shared beers during football games, joked about the shop's leaky roof. But today, Williams couldn't meet his eyes. I need to talk to you, son, he muttered, voice low. David folded his arms. Go ahead. I'm selling the building. David's face didn't move. To who? Williams hesitated. Then reached into his pocket and handed over a business card. Blackwood Properties. David didn't flinch. Just took the card, glanced at it, and slipped it into his back pocket. They offered me double market value, Williams said quickly. Said they'd help you relocate, David held up a hand. You don't owe me an explanation. I didn't want it to go down like this, the old man added. But I got grandkids, a mortgage, I get it, David said flatly. End of the month. Williams nodded, looking ashamed. I'll give you until then. After he left, David stood alone in the garage, the same space he'd built with his own hands after being pushed out of the big-name shops that didn't want colored boys talking to their wealthy customers. Now, it was being taken from him again. Only this time, David had receipts. That evening, a black SUV pulled up quietly. But this one didn't belong to Blackwood. A tall black man in a gray suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself with a firm handshake. Agent Marcus Washington. Internal Revenue Service. David raised an eyebrow. Another investigation. Washington gave a tight smile. I've received 3 tips this month about black-owned businesses supposedly evading taxes. All from the same law firm. David's eyes narrowed. Let me guess, he said. Blackwood and Associates. Washington nodded slowly. Mind if I look at your books? Be my guest. David handed over 3 years of ledgers, receipts, and logs, organized down to the penny. Washington flipped through a few pages, then looked up. Mr. Carter, someone's trying very hard to bury you. David smiled faintly. Let them try. By Monday morning, David knew the storm had officially arrived. A thick white envelope was taped to the shop's front door. Inside, a lawsuit. Richard Blackwood vs. David Carter allegations, interference with contractual engagement, emotional distress, alienation of affection. Damages sought, $200,000. David handed the papers to Isabella. Her hands trembled as she read the claims. He's saying, you seduced me to ruin his business. David nodded, jaw clenched. Classic move. Turn the helper into the villain. But this is insane. He chuckled. It's also a gift. She stared. What do you mean? Because now, legally, I get to subpoena all of his company's financial records. For the first time in days, Isabella smiled. That afternoon, David called two people. The first was Tomás Rivera, a friend from college turned award-winning investigative journalist. Rivera had made a name exposing corruption in housing and business. I've got something for you, David said. And it's bigger than zoning violations. They met that evening at a cafe downtown. David brought photos, files, and the evidence Isabella had saved. Rivera's eyes lit up with every new document. This is gold, he whispered. Bribes, fake permits, threats, this could take down half the council. And the man funding it all. Rivera leaned forward. How long do I have? Make it airtight, David said. Because he's coming hard. The second call was to Agent Washington. I've got something, David told him. Photographic evidence. Bribes. Money laundering. City contracts tied to dirty deals. There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Bring it all in tomorrow morning, Washington said. And David, be careful. Men like Blackwood. They don't fall quietly. The next day, the Tribune-Journal ran its biggest headline in months: real estate tycoon tied two city bribes, ex-fiancé and black business owner provide proof. The article exploded online. By noon, Richard's office was surrounded by reporters. By 4 p.m., every city contract under Blackwood Properties was suspended pending investigation. And by 6 p.m., federal agents had frozen his accounts. But the moment David had been waiting for came the next morning. Richard Blackwood showed up in person, no suits, no lawyers. Just fury. You think you've won? He hissed, storming into the garage. David stayed calm, wiping his hands on a rag. You lost the second you called her property. You don't understand who I am. David nodded. I do. You're the guy who thought a black mechanic wouldn't fight back. You're nothing, Richard growled. David pulled out his phone, already recording. And you're now threatening a federal witness, he said evenly. Richard froze. Then his phone rang. Richard Blackwood. FBI. Step outside. We need to talk. For the first time, the billionaire's face lost all color. Richard Blackwood didn't speak as the agents walked him to the black SUV. His cufflinks were still shining. But his hands were shaking. David stood at the edge of the garage, arms crossed, watching the man who had tried to destroy his life disappear into the back seat of a federal car. No henchmen, no lawyers, no power left to swing. Isabella stood beside him, quiet, strong. You think he'll serve real time? She asked. David exhaled slowly. He's not the kind they lock up forever. But they'll gut his empire. That's what men like him fear the most, losing the control money gave them. 6 months later, the ribbon was cut on Carter and Cole Automotive, the second location across town. The first shop was still standing. But now, it had a sister. Isabella handled the books and the business permits, her name etched beside David's on the front window. They'd married quietly, no suits, no flash. Just a courthouse, Rivera as witness, and Agent Washington dropping by with a smile and a blessing. Rivera's article had earned national attention. Washington's investigation spread deeper than expected. Multiple city council members were exposed. Several resigned. Some were indicted. Richard? He served 12 years. The man who once said everything could be bought was now relying on a public defender. David never gloated. He didn't have to. The respect he earned, the community that supported him, the peace he felt when closing up the shop at night, that was justice enough. One evening, as the sky turned orange behind the garage, Isabella leaned on the doorframe and asked, "Do you ever regret stopping that night?" David looked at her. At the life they'd built. At the chaos they'd survived. "Never," he said. Then he smiled. "Sometimes, the road you think is a detour leads you exactly where you were meant to go." She laughed softly, resting her head on his shoulder. And as the last light of day washed over the garage they nearly lost, one truth stood unshaken: some prey learn how to hunt. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.